The same hands that once stopped the soldiers from bleeding out in a war-zone hospital now rested on a wheelchair inside a Chicago family courtroom. But when the white judge mocked Colonel Evelyn Monroe for not standing, humiliation turned into something darker: racial contempt, cruelty, and a plan to take her granddaughter Lily away forever. Victor Hale believed the courtroom was his victory lap. What he didn't know was that Evelyn had spent 23 years saving lives under fire, and the woman he called broken was about to expose a corrupt system built to destroy black families. In less than 30 seconds, the courtroom energy shifted from judgment to fear. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? And if you believe some heroes are willing to look guilty to save the innocent, this story is for you. The order she could never obey. Chicago, Illinois greeted the morning with a hard gray sky and a thin February rain that painted the streets in silver. Wind moved between the tall government buildings around Cook County Family Court, carrying the bitter smell of wet concrete and exhaust. It was the kind of cold that settled into old bones and older memories. Colonel Evelyn Monroe had known colder mornings. At 75, Evelyn was a woman who carried history in every detail of her appearance. She was an African-American woman with deep brown skin softened by age, silver curls cut short and neatly shaped around a strong face, and dark eyes that had long ago learned how to hide pain behind discipline. Her shoulders were still straight, military straight, despite the years and the wheelchair beneath her. Her body had lost the use of its legs, but not its command. Her hands, lined with age yet steady as surgical instruments, rested on the polished rims of her custom black wheelchair. Once, those hands had held bleeding soldiers together under mortar fire. Now, they held the only thing she had left of her daughter's world. Her granddaughter. Lily Monroe, 8 years old, was not inside the courtroom yet. She had been taken to school by a court-appointed transport worker earlier that morning. Lily was a delicate little girl with warm, cocoa-brown skin, large, thoughtful eyes, and tightly curled black hair tied into 2 soft puffs with blue ribbons. She had inherited her mother's quiet smile, but over the last few weeks that smile had begun to fade. Since Victor Hale had started telling her that Grandma Evelyn was too old and too weak to keep up with a child, Lily had grown quieter in class, slower to laugh, and quicker to stare at the floor when adults raised their voices. That silence haunted Evelyn more than the court ever could. The courthouse entrance was already crowded. Lawyers in long coats brushed past without looking. Clerks hurried through the revolving doors with folders tucked under their arms. The accessibility ramp on the side entrance was too steep, forcing Evelyn to grip the wheels harder as she guided herself upward. At the top of the ramp, Attorney James Carter was waiting. James was 52, a tall African-American attorney with a calm, trustworthy face, warm brown eyes behind rectangular glasses, and a navy wool overcoat draped neatly over his tailored charcoal suit. His hair was cropped close, touched with gray at the temples, and there was a patient steadiness about him that came from years of fighting impossible cases. He had built his reputation defending families the system had already decided to discard. "Morning, Colonel," he said gently. Evelyn gave the smallest nod. "Morning, Counselor." He noticed the rain on her shoulders and quickly held the door wider. Inside, the fluorescent lights of the hallway washed the building in a sterile white glow. Family Courtroom B12 sat at the end of the corridor. The room itself felt colder than outside. 15 rows of wooden benches faced the elevated judge's bench. The petitioner's table was too narrow for a wheelchair, forcing James to reposition a loose chair to create space beside him. Across the aisle sat Victor Hale. Victor was 44, white, tall, and broad-shouldered, with carefully styled sandy blonde hair and a polished face that looked handsome until he smiled. Then the cruelty showed. His blue eyes were sharp, calculating, always measuring advantage. He wore a navy designer suit and a silver watch that caught the courtroom light every time he adjusted his cuff. To strangers, he looked like a respectable stepfather fighting for family. To Evelyn, he looked exactly like the man who had broken her daughter. There had been warning signs in Maya's marriage, bruises hidden beneath sleeves, Apologies whispered through tears. Excuses made for temper and alcohol and stress. Then the car accident had taken Maya forever, and Victor had come for Lily. At the back of the courtroom sat Olivia Bennett, a 36-year-old investigative journalist from the Chicago Tribune. Olivia was a white woman with sharp green eyes, shoulder-length chestnut hair, and a quiet confidence sharpened by years of exposing corruption in city systems. She dressed plainly, gray blazer, black blouse, notebook already open. But her mind missed nothing. She had arrived to cover what was supposed to be a routine custody hearing involving disability discrimination concerns. The moment she saw Evelyn enter, she sensed this was something much bigger. At precisely 9 o'clock, the side door opened. Bailiff Robert Kane stepped forward. Kane was a thick-built white man in his late 50s with a square jaw, cropped gray hair, and a face permanently hardened by authority. His uniform stretched tightly across his broad chest, badge polished, boots heavy enough to echo across the room like warnings. "All rise!" The command cracked through the courtroom. Every person stood, every chair scraped, every bench shifted. Only Evelyn remained seated. The silence that followed felt immediate and dangerous. Judge Margaret Whitmore entered with the cold composure of someone accustomed to being obeyed before she spoke. She was 63, tall, slender, and severe, with pale skin, silver blonde hair swept into a flawless low knot, and pale gray eyes that rarely softened. Years on the bench had sharpened her into a woman who mistook control for justice. Her face held the elegant chill of upper-class authority, and her reputation carried whispers of rulings that always seemed harsher for black families. Her eyes landed on Evelyn, and stayed there. "Mrs. Monroe," she said, voice crisp as glass, "did you not hear the bailiff?" James rose. "Your Honor, my client is unable to stand. I was not speaking to you, Mr. Carter." The words sliced across him. Evelyn lifted her chin. Her voice, when it came, was calm and level. "Your Honor, I am paralyzed from the waist down." Margaret Whitmore leaned back in her chair, studying Evelyn's wheelchair as if it were an inconvenience rather than reality. "I have seen many people exaggerate physical limitations in this courtroom," she said. "Age has a way of making people depend on excuses." A murmur passed through the room. Olivia's pen moved faster. Whitmore continued, eyes narrowing. "And frankly, this court must also consider whether a woman of your age, condition, and circumstances is truly capable of raising a child." Circumstances. The pause before the word made its meaning clear enough. Victor's lips curved. He stood smoothly. "Your Honor, Lily needs stability. She needs energy, structure, and someone who can actually keep up with her physically. Mrs. Monroe is elderly, disabled, and—" He glanced toward Evelyn. "Not in the best position to provide the environment a young girl deserves." Evelyn's hands tightened on the armrests. Not from fear, from memory. The courtroom vanished for a second, replaced by desert heat, burning metal, and 20 screaming soldiers in the dust of Afghanistan. She had not stood then, either. Not after the shrapnel severed her spine, but she had still dragged men to safety until every last survivor was evacuated. And now this man dared call her weak. Across the city, at Lily's elementary school, the parallel wound was already opening. Lily sat at the edge of her classroom, shoulders drawn inward. A pale blonde boy at the next table whispered, "My dad says old people in wheelchairs can't even take care of themselves." Another child giggled. Lily lowered her eyes to her worksheet. Her teacher, Miss Rachel Simmons, a warm, middle-aged black woman with soft features and patient eyes, noticed immediately. Rachel had spent 15 years teaching 3rd grade in Chicago public schools. She knew the difference between a shy child and a frightened one. Something was changing in Lily, and it had Victor's fingerprints all over it. Back in courtroom B12, James rose again. "Your Honor, Colonel Evelyn Monroe served 23 years in the Army Medical Corps. She has maintained a stable home for Lily since Maya Monroe's passing. School records and therapy reports and neighborhood statements all support. Whitmore raised a hand. We will address records later. For now, I am noting the respondent's failure to rise. Olivia looked up sharply. There it was, the humiliation made official. Victor leaned closer to his attorney, whispering with the confidence of a man who believed the room already belonged to him. But Evelyn did not look at him. She looked only at the judge, then, slowly, deliberately, she placed a small voice recorder on the table beside her folder. The tiny red light blinked once. Olivia saw it, and in that instant, she knew this was no longer just a custody story. This was the beginning of something explosive. The courtroom air shifted. A war hero in a wheelchair. A biased judge, a frightened child, a corrupt stepfather, and a city finally about to watch the wrong woman get pushed too far. The hearing had not even truly begun, and already the battlefield was drawn. The courthouse built to exclude. The rain had not stopped by the time the court recessed for the afternoon administrative review. Outside, Chicago's gray skyline blurred behind sheets of water sliding down the courthouse windows, turning the city into a watercolor of steel and glass. Inside Cook County Family Court, the fluorescent lights hummed overhead with the same lifeless indifference that seemed built into every wall of the building. Colonel Evelyn Monroe remained exactly where she had been left, at a table never designed for someone like her. The loose chair beside Attorney James Carter had shifted slightly during the hearing, narrowing her already limited space. When she tried to turn her wheelchair to reposition herself, one wheel clipped the bolted leg of the counsel table. The wood groaned. Victor Hale glanced over with the faintest smile. It was small, almost polite, but it carried the smug confidence of a man who had already noticed the room itself was fighting on his side. James crouched beside Evelyn, his voice lowered. "Don't move yet. Let me help." His expression had changed since the morning session. The calm, legal precision was still there, but beneath it sat something sharper now. Anger carefully folded into discipline. He had spent too many years watching institutional neglect masquerade as neutrality. Evelyn gave a slight nod and waited while he moved the chair farther away. Even then, the table still left barely enough clearance for the wheels. A design flaw, or maybe not a flaw at all. Across the courtroom, Judge Margaret Whitmore had already disappeared through the private side door, leaving the lingering chill of her authority behind. Bailiff Robert Kane remained stationed near the aisle, thick arms crossed over his chest, his square face unreadable except for the faint tension in his jaw whenever Evelyn maneuvered her chair. He watched her the way some men watched storms. Not afraid, just annoyed they existed. James gathered the morning files into a stack, then paused when he noticed the updated docket sheet clipped beneath the custody petition. His brows narrowed. "What is it?" Evelyn asked. He held up the paper. "The hearing schedule." She looked at the printed times. 9 a.m. Morning custody review 1:30 p.m. Accessibility and procedural motions. Tomorrow, 8:15 a.m. Witness consideration. James slid another page from the folder. Then another. 3 separate versions of the same schedule. 3 different timestamps. The first showed tomorrow's hearing at 9 o'clock. The second changed it to 8:45. The newest version read 8:15. His eyes darkened. They changed tomorrow's appearance time 3 times in less than 6 hours. Victor's attorney, seated across the aisle, pretended not to hear. Lila Mercer was a new presence in the case file that morning, recently added as Victor's lead litigation counsel. She was a white woman in her mid-40s, tall and razor-thin, with platinum blonde hair cut in a flawless shoulder-length line and cold blue eyes sharpened by years of winning through intimidation rather than brilliance. Her reputation in Chicago family courts was simple. She did not fight fair, and she never needed to when judges liked her. She adjusted the silver chain at her neck and smiled faintly. "Scheduling updates happen all the time, Mr. Carter." James stared at her. 3 times in one day. Lila's smile widened. "Some people have trouble keeping up." The insult was aimed at Evelyn. The meaning was obvious. Age, disability. Delay her arrival once, and Victor could argue procedural noncompliance. Evelyn's face did not change, but inside the old battlefield instincts had already activated. Patterns, repetition, controlled disadvantage. It was the same logic as forcing an enemy unit into bad terrain before engagement. Except now the terrain was a courthouse. When the afternoon recess formally ended, James guided Evelyn into the hallway to review the accessibility motion. That was when the courthouse itself began to speak. The side ramp that had brought her in that morning now gleamed with rainwater, steeper than ADA code allowed. A yellow warning cone sat halfway up, making passage narrower. The elevator doors nearby flashed out of service in red block letters. Again, James pressed the call button anyway. Nothing. A court clerk passing by gave them a shrug as if the broken system were weather rather than negligence. The accessible restroom on the same floor had a sign taped over the handle. Temporary maintenance issue. The women's room, one floor below, had no automatic opener, no support rails, no turning clearance, no space for dignity. Evelyn's voice stayed quiet. This building wasn't made to let people like me function. James corrected softly. It was made so people like them never had to think about you. The distinction mattered. At the far end of the hallway, Olivia Bennett stood near the records office with her notebook tucked under one arm and her phone in the other. She had changed from observation mode into pursuit. The moment the morning hearing ended, she had requested access to prior disability accommodation complaints filed against Cook County Family Court. The clerk behind the glass window, a short Latino man in his late 30s named Miguel Alvarez, looked exhausted in the particular way public servants did when they had spent too many years watching wrongdoing they couldn't stop. His thinning dark hair was combed carefully, and his gentle brown eyes kept darting toward the security cameras mounted in the ceiling corners. He lowered his voice. "You didn't get this from me." He slid a thin stack of old case indexes beneath the glass. 14 names, all black parents, all disabled litigants. Every one of them had lost custody or visitation rights under Judge Margaret Whitmore within the last 7 years. Olivia felt the temperature in the hallway drop. The pattern was too clean, too consistent, too deliberate. Her pen moved fast. At the bottom of the list, one case caught her attention. Samuel Reed, Visa, Illinois Family Services. She repeated the name quietly. Miguel hesitated before answering. "He still comes by sometimes." "Why?" Miguel looked toward the dead elevator doors. "Because his son turns 16 next month, and he still hasn't stopped trying." The words followed Olivia long after she left the window. By early evening, the rain had eased into a cold mist. Evelyn and James exited through the side corridor because the main elevator remained dead. At the bottom of the too steep ramp stood a man beneath a black umbrella. Tall, broad-shouldered even in age, dark-skinned and seated in a weathered military-grade wheelchair. Samuel Reed. He looked about 70, an African-American veteran with a shaved gray beard, a scar crossing one cheekbone, and eyes so steady they immediately reminded Evelyn of men who had survived things no one else could understand. His coat was old army green, pressed carefully despite its age, and his left sleeve hung slightly loose below the elbow where an old combat injury had left limited movement. He gave her a slow nod. "Colonel Monroe." Evelyn stopped. "You know me?" Samuel's mouth curved with something close to bitter recognition. "I know what they're doing to you." James stepped protectively closer, but Samuel lifted one hand. "Easy, counselor. I'm not the enemy." Olivia, who had just stepped outside behind them, froze when she recognized the name from the files. Samuel looked at Evelyn directly. 5 years ago, same judge, same courtroom, same kind of comments. Too old, too black, too disabled, too damaged from war. His eyes flicked toward the courthouse doors. "They took my boy because I couldn't climb the courthouse stairs fast enough when the elevator broke." Silence settled around them. Only the sound of wet tires on Chicago streets moved through the air. Evelyn studied him. The rigid spine, the measured speech, the old soldier's refusal to let grief fully show. There was history here, pain made disciplined. "What happened after?" she asked. Samuel gave a hollow laugh. "Nothing. That's the point. Nothing happened. No appeal moved, no complaint survived. The system just kept going." Olivia stepped closer, notebook ready. "Mr. Reed, would you be willing to talk on record?" He looked at her carefully. His distrust had been earned, not inherited. Then he looked back at Evelyn. "If she's still fighting, I'm still fighting." The sentence landed heavier than the rain. James folded the revised schedules into his briefcase. "Tomorrow we document every access violation, every time change, every obstruction." Evelyn looked up at the courthouse windows, each pane reflecting the fading gray sky. The building looked enormous, immovable, but she had seen fortresses fall before, and now for the first time she knew she was not the first soldier this courthouse had tried to bury. She was simply the one who arrived prepared. Maya's secret letters. The mist over Chicago had thickened into a pale silver fog by the time Colonel Evelyn Monroe returned home that evening. Her house sat on a quiet south side street lined with bare winter trees and old brick homes that had survived decades of hard weather, much like the woman who now rolled slowly up the narrow front path. The porch light glowed warm against the cold, casting long shadows across the wooden ramp James had insisted on reinforcing after Maya's accident. Inside, the house still carried traces of her daughter: lavender hand soap in the downstairs bathroom, a framed photograph of Maya laughing in summer sunlight, and Lily's small pink backpack resting by the couch where she had dropped it after school. The silence inside was heavier than the courthouse. Evelyn moved through it carefully, wheeling past the kitchen and into the living room where the shelves held family photographs and military plaques in uneasy harmony. She stopped before the largest frame. Maya Monroe, her daughter, forever frozen at 32. Maya had been a striking black woman with soft, almond-shaped eyes, smooth caramel skin, and a smile that could disarm any room. She had inherited Evelyn's quiet strength, but not her instinct for battle. Maya had always tried to love people into becoming better than they were, and that hope had cost her dearly when she married Victor Hale. Evelyn stared at the photo longer than usual. Something Samuel Reed had said outside the courthouse kept echoing in her mind. The system just kept going. Victor was not just a man. He was a pattern, a method, a kind of predator who learned which institutions rewarded charm over truth. The realization led Evelyn toward the hallway closet. At the back of the top shelf sat a cedar memory box Maya had once called her rainy day archive. It was old, hand-carved, and slightly scratched at the corners from years of moving apartments before Maya bought the house. Evelyn had not opened it since the funeral. Her fingers hesitated only once. Inside were school report cards, Lily's first crayon drawing, a dried church program from Maya's wedding, and beneath those, a bundle of envelopes tied with faded blue ribbon. Letters. All addressed but never mailed. The first envelope read simply, "Mom, if anything ever happens." Evelyn's chest tightened. She unfolded the first letter with the same careful hands that had once sutured wounds under fire. Maya's handwriting was unmistakable, rounded, elegant, and steady, even when the words themselves trembled with fear. "Victor watches every dollar now. He says it's because families need structure, but it feels like I have to ask permission to breathe." He moved Lily's education trust statements out of the office drawer and told me I was too emotional to manage finances. Last week he asked about my life insurance policy again. I laughed it off, but he didn't laugh. Evelyn read it twice. Then a third time. There were 6 letters in total, each one darker than the last. In another, Maya wrote, "He never hits where people can see. It's words, silence, locked bank accounts, telling Lily that Mommy makes bad decisions. He says if I ever leave, I won't take anything with me, not the house, not the money, not Lily." The room seemed to contract around Evelyn. This was no longer grief, this was evidence. When James Carter arrived 30 minutes later, the city outside had gone fully dark, streetlights glowing in the fog. He entered with his usual measured calm, though the strain of the day still sat in the tightness around his eyes. Evelyn handed him the letters without speaking. He read, standing up. By the third page, the legal precision in his face sharpened into something colder. "This changes motive," he said quietly. Evelyn's gaze never left Maya's handwriting. "Say it." James exhaled. "Victor isn't fighting for Lily, he's fighting for access to Maya's insurance settlement, Lily's education trust, and control over any survivor benefits tied to her guardianship." The truth had always been there. Now it had shape. James laid the letters in chronological order across the dining table. The financial control alone is enough to establish a pattern, but combined with the emotional abuse, he looked up. "This gives us leverage." Before Evelyn could answer, the front doorbell rang. Samuel Reed stood on the porch, framed by the porch light and the faint fog drifting through the street. Tonight he wore a heavy wool coat over his military green sweater, his wheelchair slick with droplets from the mist outside. His face looked older in warm light, the deep lines around his eyes carved by 5 years of fighting not a war, but a bureaucracy. Evelyn let him in. Samuel's gaze settled on the letters spread across the table. "She kept records," he said. Evelyn nodded. Samuel's expression turned inward, pulled by memory. "My wife, Denise, did the same before she passed." This was the first time he had mentioned her. He spoke slowly, the words moving through old scar tissue. Denise Reed had been a black pediatric nurse, soft-spoken and fiercely observant, with narrow shoulders, bright, intelligent eyes, and the kind of quiet patience children trusted instantly. A hospital infection had taken her 6 years ago, only months before Samuel's custody hearing. Before she died, she had left journal notes documenting how Illinois Family Services ignored Samuel's adaptive parenting setup because they saw the wheelchair before they saw the father. They said a disabled black veteran couldn't provide stable masculine structure, Samuel said, bitterness flattening his voice. What they meant was they'd already decided what fathers like me look like. James looked up sharply. "Do you still have her notes?" Samuel met his eyes. Every page. A silence of mutual understanding passed through the room. Not just victims, witnesses. At the same hour, across downtown Chicago, Olivia Bennett sat inside the Tribune Archives office with 3 case folders spread open beneath a brass reading lamp. Her coffee had gone cold an hour ago, but she barely noticed. The financial records she had subpoenaed from Victor Hale's business holdings told their own story. Victor had recently hired Lila Mercer's private consulting firm, not just as legal counsel but for asset preservation advisory services. Olivia leaned closer. One of the invoices referenced an after-hours meeting at the Lakefront Equity Club, a private donor event known for attracting judges, city officials, and high-dollar attorneys. Attached guest confirmations included one name that made her pulse jump: Judge Margaret Whitmore. The connection was not yet illegal, but it was personal, and personal was enough to poison custody court neutrality. Olivia circled the line in red ink. The story was growing teeth. Meanwhile, at school, Lily Monroe sat in the art room beneath a paper banner reading Winter Memory Week. Miss Rachel Simmons had asked the children to draw someone who made them feel safe. Most children drew parents. Some drew pets. Lily drew her mother. Maya stood in the center of the page with long, dark curls, smiling beside a little girl under a ceiling full of stars. Then Lily's crayon stopped moving. A memory had surfaced. Victor standing in the kitchen, her mother crying quietly by the sink. A shattered coffee mug on the floor. Victor's voice low and dangerous. "If you tell your grandmother, you won't like what happens next." Lily's small fingers tightened around the blue crayon. Miss Simmons noticed her trembling and crouched beside her desk. Rachel's voice remained soft, practiced by years of protecting children from the truths adults created. "Lily, sweetheart, are you okay?" Lily stared at the drawing, then whispered, "Mom used to cry when Victor was around." Rachel's face changed. Teachers learned to hear the weight behind certain sentences. This was one of them. She placed a steady hand over Lily's desk. "Thank you for telling me." Back at Evelyn's house, the dining table had become a war map of paper evidence. Maya's letters, Samuel's wife's archived notes, financial printouts, trust records. Every line pointed to the same truth. Victor Hale's interest in Lily had never been paternal. It was strategic. Evelyn looked down at the final letter. "Mom, if something happens to me, don't let him teach Lily to fear her own strength." Her eyes closed. For a moment, grief returned in its purest form. Not loud, not dramatic, just the ache of a daughter who had known she was losing ground longs before the car accident ever happened. When Evelyn opened her eyes again, the ache had hardened into resolve. James slid the letters carefully into legal sleeves. Samuel placed a weathered notebook on the table beside them. Denise Reed's journals. And outside, Chicago's fog pressed against the windows like the city itself was holding its breath. The evidence was finally beginning to speak. And for the first time since Maya died, Evelyn no longer felt like she was fighting memory alone. The Colonel's war record. Chicago woke beneath a brittle blue winter sky the next morning. The rain finally gone but replaced by a sharp wind that cut between the stone buildings downtown like a blade. Sunlight reflected off the frozen edges of the courthouse steps, making Cook County Family Court look cleaner than it truly was, as if the city itself wanted to hide the rot beneath polished granite. Colonel Evelyn Monroe arrived before 8, her black wheelchair rolling across the salt-dusted pavement with the steady precision of someone who had spent a lifetime learning how to enter hostile territory early. Attorney James Carter was already waiting by the side entrance, 2 garment bags slung over one shoulder and a thick leather case tucked under his arm. His face carried the controlled fatigue of a man who had spent most of the night preparing not just a defense, but a revelation. "They moved the hearing again," he said quietly as he opened the side door. "Back to 9. I made them confirm it in writing this time." Evelyn gave him a nod that held equal parts approval and exhaustion. She had slept only a few hours. Maya's letters had stayed in her mind all night, layered now with Denise Reed's journals and Lily's frightened memory from the classroom. But today was not about grief. Today was about truth with rank and documentation. Courtroom B12 felt different before anyone even spoke. The room was more crowded than the previous session. Word had spread after Olivia Bennett's first Short Tribune preview article went live before dawn under the headline, "Disabled Black Grandmother Faces Bias Questions in Cook County Custody Fight." Several reporters now occupied the back benches, though none sat as alertly as Olivia herself. Dressed in a dark emerald blazer over a black turtleneck, her chestnut hair pinned back in a practical knot, she looked less like a journalist today and more like a surgeon preparing to expose something fatal. Victor Hale noticed the extra media presence, too. His perfect blonde hair was more carefully styled than usual. His navy suit upgraded to charcoal, as if tailoring alone could make him appear sympathetic. But the slight stiffness in his jaw betrayed nerves. Beside him, Lila Mercer's sharp blue eyes moved constantly between the reporters, the judge's empty bench, and James's locked leather case. She knew something had changed. At exactly 9, Bailiff Robert Kane called the room to order, his voice still carrying that old command room aggression. But this time, even he seemed aware the atmosphere had shifted. Judge Margaret Whitmore entered with the same glacial composure as before, silver blonde hair immaculate, pale face unreadable. Yet, when she saw the extra press in the gallery, her expression tightened by a fraction. James stood before the judge could begin procedural remarks. "Your Honor, before witness scheduling resumes, the defense moves to introduce Respondent Exhibit E4, Colonel Evelyn Monroe's official United States Army Medical Corps service record." The courtroom went still. Victor's head turned sharply. Lila rose halfway. "Objection, relevance." James was ready. "The petitioner has repeatedly argued that Colonel Monroe's disability and age render her incapable of guardianship. Her service history directly addresses capability, leadership under crisis, and long-term evidence of adaptive resilience." Whitmore hesitated. For the first time, the pause did not feel like power. It felt like calculation under scrutiny. "Proceed," she said coldly. James opened the leather case. Inside lay military folders protected in clear archival sleeves, bronze-edged commendation copies, medical retirement documentation, and a folded ceremonial citation sheet stamped with Pentagon seals. He laid them on the table with the precision of a man unveiling sacred evidence. Colonel Evelyn Monroe served 23 years in the United States Army Medical Corps, he began, his voice carrying cleanly through the room. She completed multiple overseas deployments, including Baghdad in 2006 and Kandahar, Afghanistan in 2013. The word Kandahar landed differently. Even the reporter's pens slowed. James lifted the commendation citation. During an insurgent mortar strike on a field trauma station outside Kandahar, Colonel Monroe remained in the surgical tent after the evacuation order to stabilize 20 wounded soldiers. Olivia's eyes flicked toward Evelyn. For the first time, she saw not merely a dignified grandmother in a wheelchair, but the outline of a battlefield survivor who had carried war home in silence. James continued. According to the Bronze Star citation, Colonel Monroe personally coordinated triage, blood flow control, and emergency extraction under active bombardment. She physically shielded the final wounded corporal during a secondary blast. The courtroom had become so quiet that the rustle of the citation page sounded enormous. James's voice lowered, sharper now. The shrapnel from that blast severed the L1 segment of her spinal cord. Victor's confidence visibly faltered. A reporter in the back whispered, "Jesus." James lifted the Purple Heart certificate next. Colonel Monroe received the Bronze Star for valor and the Purple Heart for wounds sustained while preserving the lives of 20 service members. She did not lose the use of her legs in decline. She lost them saving American soldiers. No one moved. Even Judge Whitmore's face had changed. The old aristocratic chill remained, but now it was pierced by the unmistakable discomfort of a narrative she could no longer reduce to age and race alone. Evelyn herself remained motionless. Her silver curls framed a face calm enough to seem detached. But inside, the old sounds had returned. The scream of metal, shouted vitals, dust and blood mixing under floodlights in the tent. She remembered the final soldier, Corporal Aaron Mills, a 22-year-old white medic from Ohio with freckles across his nose and hands shaking from blood loss. He had kept apologizing while she worked. "I'm sorry, ma'am, I'm sorry." She had told him the same thing she told all frightened boys in uniform. "Save the apology for when you get home." He made it home. She never walked again. Across the city, in Miss Rachel Simmons's classroom, Lily Monroe sat at her small desk beneath a paper snowflake mobile. Rachel had asked the class to write a short essay titled, "My Hero." Lily stared at the lined paper for a long moment before beginning. "My grandmother is my hero because she is brave even when people are mean to her. She was in the army and saved 20 soldiers. She makes pancakes shaped like stars because my mom liked stars. When I get scared, she tells me brave people can still be scared. They just keep going." Rachel Simmons read the essay twice. Rachel was a woman shaped by empathy and vigilance, a black educator in her mid-40s whose own brother had once been failed by a biased school discipline system. She understood the power of testimony when institutions refused to listen. Without changing a word, she photographed Lily's essay and posted it. First to the school's protected classroom page, then later, with permission from James's office, to her public educator account. Within an hour, the image spread. By lunchtime, local parent groups had reposted it. By afternoon, Chicago veterans organizations were sharing it with captions like, "This is what real strength looks like." At the Tribune, Olivia Bennett sat before dual monitors, the courthouse morning still burning in her memory. Her second article went live under a far more direct title, "Racial Bias and Disability Exclusion in Cook County, Family Court, How One Colonel's Case Exposes a Pattern." The article did more than recount the hearing. It tied Evelyn's public humiliation to the 14 previous cases, to Samuel Reed's testimony, and to statistical disparities in Judge Whitmore's custody rulings involving black families and disabled guardians. Her phone began vibrating before the article even finished updating. Calls from legal aid groups, emails from former litigants. One message's subject line simply read, "She did the same thing to me." Back in court, James placed the final medical file into evidence. Colonel Monroe's attending Army Rehabilitation Board notes confirm full cognitive function, exceptional adaptive living scores, and long-term successful guardianship support capacity. Lila Mercer stood, but the confidence was gone from her posture. Military valor does not automatically qualify someone to raise a child. James turned toward her. No, but it destroys the lie that resilience can be measured by whether someone can stand. The line struck the room like a verdict. Victor looked away first. Judge Whitmore called for a 10-minute recess, but even her voice had lost some of its earlier edge. The mythology of weakness had cracked. When the room emptied into murmuring hallways, Evelyn remained at the defense table, sunlight from the high windows touching the Purple Heart citation beside her hand. For years, she had hidden this part of herself because war stories too often became spectacle. Today it had become shield, not for pride, for Lily, and somewhere across Chicago, a little girl's essay about star-shaped pancakes was turning her grandmother into something the courthouse could no longer control. A public symbol, a war hero, a black woman they had mistaken for easy to dismiss, the collapse of the old system. By late afternoon, Chicago's winter sun had already begun sinking behind the skyline, turning the glass towers downtown into sheets of bronze fire. The courthouse windows reflected that fading light in long, fractured lines across the hallway floor, as if the building itself were beginning to crack. The 10-minute recess from the morning hearing had stretched into nearly an hour, not because the court needed time, but because the city outside had already started moving faster than the system inside could contain. Olivia Bennett was the first spark. She sat in the Tribune's mobile press workspace parked 2 blocks from Cook County Family Court, the interior lit by laptop glow and the constant vibration of incoming messages. Her chestnut hair had come loose from its knot, a sign she had stopped caring about appearances and shifted fully into pursuit mode. On the screen before her, the image was unmistakable. Judge Margaret Whitmore, silver blonde hair swept into her signature low knot, standing beside Lila Mercer and Victor Hale at a private charity gala hosted by the Lakefront Equity Foundation 3 months earlier. The event had been marketed publicly as a donor dinner for foster care scholarships, but the metadata told a different story. Timestamp, 11:43 p.m. Private room, Founders Lounge guest list, restricted no public press access. Victor's hand rested lightly on the back of Lila's chair. Whitmore stood close enough to suggest not chance, but familiarity. Olivia's jaw tightened. This was no longer circumstantial optics. This was proximity, privilege, and potential collusion. Beside the image sat the second layer of proof. Internal courthouse email logs provided anonymously by Miguel Alvarez from the records office. The subject lines alone were devastating. RE. Schedule adjustment for Hale custody matter. RE. Whitmore Chamber. Preference. Early appearance. RE. Ensure respondent compliance issue preserved. The final line made Olivia stop breathing for a second. If Monroe misses revised call time, grounds for procedural concern become stronger. The wording was sterile. Its intent was not. She attached the hallway security footage next. The video had been quietly sent by a courthouse maintenance worker named Eddie Lawson, a lean black man in his early 60s with deep-set eyes, oil-stained hands, and the weary courage of someone who had spent decades seeing powerful people assume workers were invisible. Eddie had once served as a city bus mechanic before switching to courthouse facilities after his wife's cancer treatments left them drowning in medical debt. He knew every dead elevator, every disabled security camera, every corridor the judges thought no one watched. The footage showed Victor Hale cornering Evelyn Monroe outside the disabled restroom the day before. His body blocked her path. His mouth moved in a low, furious line of words. Though the hallway camera had no audio, the image of his finger stabbing toward Evelyn's chest was enough. At one point, he slammed his palm against the wall inches from her face. threat, intimidation, predatory certainty, Olivia uploaded everything. The article headline changed from investigative to explosive. Cook County judge linked to opposing counsel and litigant in Monroe custody case. Emails and security footage. Raise questions of bias. The story went live at 4:17 p.m. By 4:24, it was trending across Chicago legal circles. By 4:31, statewide disability rights groups had reposted it. By 4:40, veterans advocacy pages and Black family justice networks had amplified it nationally. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere shifted before anyone officially announced why. Clerks began whispering in hallways. Phones rang nonstop at the family court administrative desk. Bailiff Robert Kane's usual stone-faced control was cracking around the edges. He stood outside courtroom B12 with his thick arms folded too tightly, jaw flexing every time another phone buzzed from a clerk's desk nearby. Kane had spent 30 years building himself into the kind of officer who believed intimidation was simply another form of order. His heavy build, steel-gray crew cut, and permanent scowl had always made petitioners smaller around him. Today, for the first time, the room seemed to be shrinking around him. Samuel Reed arrived before the recess officially ended. He rolled down the main hallway in his weathered military wheelchair, army green coat buttoned to the throat, Denise's journals secured in a leather satchel across his lap. His scarred cheek and steady dark eyes drew glances now. Not pitying ones, but the kind reserved for a man stepping knowingly into history. He stopped beside Evelyn and James Carter. "I'm filing it today," Samuel said. James understood immediately. "Your original complaint." Samuel nodded. 5 years too late, but not too late to matter. With him came others. A Black mother in her 30s named Danielle Ross, slim and exhausted-looking with tired eyes and a toddler's photo tucked into her wallet, approached clutching a folded custody order. Judge Whitmore had once ruled against her after citing unstable emotional temperament following postpartum depression treatment. Behind her came Marcus Green, a broad-shouldered Black father with a prosthetic leg and a janitor's uniform beneath his winter coat. His voice shook when he told James the same judge once questioned whether a physically incomplete household leader could model discipline. One by one, the hallway filled. Black parents, disabled guardians, veterans, single mothers, each carrying paperwork like fragments of the same wound. The old system was no longer hidden in isolated stories. It had become visible as pattern. Inside chambers, Margaret Whitmore had not yet re-entered the courtroom. For the first time in years, the judge who had always controlled the narrative was trapped inside one she did not author. Her chambers clerk, Eleanor Price, a severe white woman in her late 50s with a stiff posture and pale hands always folded at her waist, stepped into the hallway carrying a sealed envelope. Eleanor had spent decades protecting the procedural image of the court, but even her loyalty had limits when headlines reached judicial oversight. She approached James. "Administrative Review Board," she said quietly. The envelope bore the seal of the Illinois Judicial Conduct Commission. Every conversation in the hallway stopped. James opened it carefully. The letter inside was brief. Effective immediately, Judge Margaret Whitmore was suspended pending emergency ethics review related to ex parte communication concerns, prejudicial conduct allegations, and undisclosed relationships impacting neutrality. Victor Hale, standing several yards away with Lila Mercer, went visibly pale. Lila recovered first. "This is temporary." But even she no longer sounded convinced. The courthouse intercom crackled. "All parties in Monroe custody matter. Administrative proceedings postponed pending reassignment." A murmur swept through the corridor. Then another voice cut through it. "Tell them about Kane." It came from Danielle Ross. All eyes turned. Her tired face had hardened into something braver than fear. She pointed directly at Bailiff Robert Kane. "He told me if I kept filing complaints, I'd never see my son without supervision again." The words detonated. Marcus Green spoke next. "He told me disabled fathers don't look authoritative in front of children." Another woman stepped forward, then another. a Hispanic grandmother in a brown wool shawl, a black father with hearing aids, a white mother advocating for her autistic daughter's black adoptive father. The stories aligned. Threats in hallways, pressure near elevators, warnings disguised as advice. Kane's face darkened. "These are accusations." "No," Samuel said, voice low and steady. "These are witnesses." Olivia's phone camera captured every second. Eddie Lawson, still in his courthouse maintenance uniform, stepped from the service hallway carrying a flash drive in his oil-marked hand. "There's more footage," he said. His voice was rough from years of breathing machine dust and swallowing silence. Not just Victor, Kane, too. Different dates. The hallway erupted into overlapping voices. James placed a hand lightly on Evelyn's chair. For the first time since this began, the fight was no longer hers alone. The courthouse that had once isolated every injured family into private defeat was now forcing all their stories into the same room. Evelyn looked down the corridor at the gathered parents. So many faces, so many years stolen by the same machinery. The building around them had not changed. The dead elevator still blinked red. The ramp remained too steep. The benches inside still excluded wheels, but the system itself had begun doing something it was never designed to do. It was collapsing under the weight of its own pattern. And as the winter light faded entirely from the courthouse windows, Colonel Evelyn Monroe understood something deeper than victory. This was no longer about surviving one courtroom. This was the beginning of tearing down the architecture that had fed on silence. The trial of truth. Chicago rose into the morning beneath a clear steel blue sky, the kind of cold, bright winter day that made every building edge look sharper and every truth feel harder to hide. By the time Colonel Evelyn Monroe arrived at Cook County Family Court, television vans had already lined the street outside. Satellite dishes pointed toward the pale sky like metal witnesses. The courthouse steps, once just another piece of hostile architecture, had become a stage for something larger than one custody battle. Microphones, camera crews, and legal observers filled the entrance plaza, their breath visible in the freezing air. For the first time since this began, the system looked nervous. Inside courtroom B12, the atmosphere had transformed. The dead elevator had finally been repaired overnight under public scrutiny. The too-steep side ramp now marked with temporary correction rails, and the defense table had been replaced with a wider movable station that could fully accommodate Evelyn's wheelchair. The changes were hurried, imperfect, and obviously reactive, but their symbolism mattered. The room was no longer arranged against her. At precisely 9, the courtroom door opened. Judge Thomas Walker entered. Walker was a 67-year-old black judge with deep mahogany skin, close-cropped silver hair, and a broad, thoughtful face lined by years of measured decisions. He carried himself with the stillness of a man who understood that authority did not need spectacle. His dark eyes were patient but penetrating, the kind that listened before deciding. A former public defender before ascending to the family bench, Walker had built a reputation across Illinois as a jurist who cared more about structural fairness than legal theater. The room rose. Evelyn remained seated, and for the first time, no one looked at her with contempt. Judge Walker gave the smallest respectful nod in her direction before taking the bench. "Let the record reflect," he said in a deep, even voice, "that Colonel Evelyn Monroe remains seated due to permanent combat-related disability." A silence followed, but this silence healed instead of humiliated. Victor Hale sat rigid at the petitioner's table. His carefully chosen suit now looked less like power and more like costume. The public unraveling of Judge Whitmore's suspension had aged him overnight. His blonde hair remained perfect, but the skin beneath his eyes carried the first visible shadows of fear. Beside him, Lila Mercer's usual predatory confidence had narrowed into hypervigilance. Her pale blue eyes tracked every movement from bench to gallery, calculating damage control rather than strategy. James Carter rose first. His charcoal suit was immaculate, but his expression carried something stronger than preparation now: momentum. "Your Honor, the defense moves to admit cumulative evidence previously delayed under procedural obstruction." Walker nodded. Proceed. The trial that followed felt unlike any hearing the room had seen. For the first time, every fact was allowed to breathe. James began with Maya Monroe's letters, each one sealed in clear evidence sleeves. He read the passages detailing Victor's financial control, emotional intimidation, and obsession with Lily's trust fund. The courtroom listened without interruption as Maya's voice returned from the dead through ink and fear. Victor stared straight ahead. His jaw tightened when James read the line. He asked about my life insurance policy again. Then came the hallway security footage. The large courtroom monitor flickered to life. Victor appeared on screen, cornering Evelyn near the disabled restroom, palm slamming against the wall inches from her face. Even without sound, the violence in the body language was undeniable. Judge Walker leaned slightly forward. "Mr. Hale," he said calmly, "do you dispute that this is you?" Victor's answer came slower than usual. "I was frustrated," James's voice cut in. "At a 75-year-old disabled war veteran." Victor said nothing. The silence condemned him more effectively than argument. Next came the military file. James did not dramatize it this time. He simply placed Colonel Monroe's Bronze Star Citation, Purple Heart Certificate, and Army Rehabilitation Board assessments into the official record, letting their authority stand on its own. Walker reviewed each page with deliberate care. 23 years of service, he said quietly, almost to himself, adaptive capacity rated exceptional. Victor's attorney made no objection. The war record no longer served as emotional spectacle. Now it was structural proof of resilience. Then the court called the new expert witness. Dr. Hannah Price, a child psychologist in her early 50s, stepped to the stand. She was a white woman with short auburn hair, soft gray eyes, and a calm, grounded presence shaped by decades of trauma counseling. Her voice carried the practiced steadiness of someone who had spent years creating safety for frightened children. A divorce in her own early life had pushed her toward family trauma work, and it showed in the compassion with which she chose every word. "I conducted 3 independent sessions with Lily Monroe," she testified. Her fear response intensifies specifically when discussing Mr. Victor Hale. James approached. "Can you explain that fear?" Dr. Price folded her hands. "Lily demonstrates anticipatory anxiety, physical tension, and memory suppression patterns consistent with prolonged emotional intimidation in a domestic environment." Victor's face hardened. The judge noticed. "Doctor," Walker asked, "in your professional opinion, where does the child feel safest?" "With Colonel Monroe," Dr. Price answered without hesitation. The sentence landed like sunlight in a dark room. James then introduced the financial records, trust statements, insurance policy updates, Victor's recent attempts to contact the Trust Management Office, a newly surfaced transfer request drafted but never finalized. The paper trail was clinical in its cruelty. Victor Hale's petition for custody aligned precisely with access triggers to Lily's education trust and survivor assets. James's closing line was simple. "This is not guardianship. This is acquisition." The room absorbed it. Meanwhile, outside the custody case itself, the ripples had widened. Samuel Reed sat in a second-floor administrative chamber reopening his 5-year-old custody file. Across from him sat Judge Elena Morales, a middle-aged Latina appellate family judge temporarily assigned to review systemic complaints. She was short, sharp-featured, and known for a relentless intolerance of procedural abuse after her own sister lost parental rights during a mental health crisis years earlier. Samuel placed Denise's journals on the table. "This time," he said, "the truth has witnesses." Elsewhere in the building, Olivia Bennett coordinated with national legal correspondents now arriving from New York, Atlanta, and Washington. Her newest Tribune article had expanded beyond Cook County. A pattern beyond one court. How disability and race bias shaped Illinois family custody for a decade. Her inbox now held stories from Milwaukee, Detroit, and St. Louis. The problem was larger than one judge, larger than one city. National media had begun calling it the Monroe pattern. By late afternoon, Courtroom B12 had become almost sacred in its stillness. Judge Walker reviewed the complete record: Maya's letters, the security footage, military commendations, Dr. Price's testimony, and Victor's financial maneuvers. Then he looked directly at Victor Hale. "What exactly," he asked, voice low and deliberate, "makes you believe this court should place Lily Monroe in your custody?" Victor opened his mouth. No polished answer came. No rehearsed paternal script survived the evidence. Only silence. The kind that stripped performance down to motive. Evelyn sat upright in her wheelchair, silver curls touched by the pale winter sunlight spilling through the high windows. For the first time in this courthouse, the room no longer felt like enemy terrain. It felt like a place where facts could finally exist without being edited by prejudice. And as the last light of day stretched across the courtroom floor, the truth stood complete. Not yet judgment, but undeniable. A child feared Victor. A dead mother had warned against him. A war hero grandmother had built a life around protection. A financial trail exposed greed. And beyond these walls, an entire nation had started watching the architecture of bias reveal itself in real time. The trial had finally become what it should always have been. Not a test of Evelyn Monroe's worth, but a reckoning with the lies that had once tried to define it. Home beneath the stars. Chicago wore the final day of the hearing like a held breath. The morning sky was pale gold at the edges, winter sunlight breaking over Lake Michigan and washing the city in a cold, hopeful brightness. Outside Cook County Family Court, the plaza had transformed into something between a legal gathering and a vigil. Veterans in dress coats stood beside disability rights advocates holding handmade signs. Black families who had once walked these steps in silence now stood openly in support. Camera crews lined the barricades, their lenses trained toward the courthouse doors, waiting for the conclusion of a case that had become far larger than one child, one grandmother, or one judge. Inside Courtroom B12, the silence felt sacred. Judge Thomas Walker sat at the bench with both hands folded over the case file, his deep brown face composed, silver hair catching the winter light from the high windows. He had spent the previous evening reviewing every page again: Maya's letters, Lily's psychological assessment, Victor Hale's financial trail, the military commendations, the hallway footage, and the reopened complaints that now stretched beyond Cook County. His reputation had been built on careful decisions, but this morning there was something heavier in his expression, the awareness that what he was about to say would echo far beyond this room. Colonel Evelyn Monroe sat upright at the defense table, her black wheelchair now fitting naturally into the redesigned space. Her silver curls framed a face that held the discipline of a soldier and the tenderness of a grandmother in equal measure. The years had left lines around her eyes, but this morning those lines looked less like age and more like roads survived. Her gloved hands rested calmly in her lap, though beneath the leather she could feel the tremor of anticipation. Across from her, Victor Hale looked like a man watching his reflection disappear. His expensive charcoal suit was still flawless, but the confidence that once animated him had drained into pallor. His blonde hair remained carefully set, yet his jaw worked nervously each time he glanced toward the press gallery. Beside him, Lila Mercer's usual icy poise had thinned into resignation. She knew the architecture of this case had shifted beyond legal salvage. Judge Walker spoke at last. Having reviewed the complete evidentiary record, this court finds overwhelming proof that the petitioner, Mr. Victor Hale, pursued custodial rights for financial access, not for the best interest of the child. No one in the room moved. Walker continued, his deep voice filling every corner of the courtroom. The court further finds credible evidence of emotional intimidation, manipulative conduct toward the minor, and threatening behavior toward Colonel Monroe within courthouse premises. Victor's eyes dropped. For the first time, there was no angle left to hide behind. Judge Walker turned toward Evelyn. This court awards full legal and physical custody of Lily Monroe to Colonel Evelyn Monroe, effective immediately. The words did not explode. They landed, heavy, final, healing. Evelyn closed her eyes for just 1 second. 23 years of war, the loss of Maya, the humiliation of the first hearing, the dead elevator, the threats in the hallway, all of it collapsed into that single sentence. Walker was not finished. Mr. Victor Hale is hereby prohibited from direct or indirect contact with the child pending criminal review. This court is also referring the evidentiary record concerning financial manipulation, harassment, and custodial fraud to the Cook County State's Attorney's Office for immediate prosecution. A gasp moved through the gallery. Victor looked up sharply. This is absurd. Walker's gaze hardened. No, Mr. Hale. What was absurd was believing this court would continue mistaking greed for guardianship. Even Lila Mercer said nothing. The room had moved beyond defense. At the rear bench, Olivia Bennett lowered her notebook slowly. Her green eyes, usually sharp with investigative distance, softened for the first time in days. She had chronicled systems collapsing before, but rarely had she watched one life rebuilt in the same breath. The courthouse doors opened minutes later to a storm of camera flashes. Evelyn emerged first, Lily already at her side. Lily Monroe, in her blue wool coat and white knitted gloves, looked smaller against the crowd, but brighter somehow. The old shadow in her expression replaced by cautious joy. Her tightly curled black hair bounced beneath a navy hat as she looked up at Evelyn and then at the reporters surrounding them. A veteran in uniform saluted. Then another. Soon, nearly half the plaza had raised hands to foreheads. Not for spectacle. For respect. Evelyn paused only long enough to place one hand over Lily's shoulder. No speech, no grandstanding. The image alone became headline enough. That evening, Southside Chicago felt softer than it had in months. The Monroe house glowed warm against the dark street, porch light spilling across the wooden ramp as James Carter wheeled Lily's small suitcase up behind them. Inside, the familiar scent of cinnamon and cedar greeted them. Unchanged by the storm the world had become outside. Lily ran first to her room. The door opened onto the same ceiling Maya had decorated years ago. Dozens of glow-in-the-dark stars scattered above the bed in constellations only mother and daughter had ever truly understood. For a long moment, Lily simply stood there. Her cocoa-brown face tilted upward, dark eyes filling with reflected green light as the stars slowly awakened in the dim room. "She kept them," Lily whispered. Evelyn's voice was softer than war had ever allowed it to be. "Your mom wanted you to always sleep under something bright." Lily climbed onto the bed and curled beneath the quilt Maya had sewn, fingers brushing the stitched edges. Then she looked at Evelyn. "Can I stay here forever?" Evelyn moved her wheelchair beside the bed and took Lily's hand. "That's exactly the plan." Across the city, the ending of one family's war had begun healing another. Samuel Reed stood outside a small brick duplex in Oak Park, winter dusk settling over the neighborhood. Beside him stood a teenage boy of nearly 16, tall, dark-skinned, with his father's steady eyes and Denise's quiet expression. Isaiah Reed. He was lean, serious, and carried the guarded stillness of a child who had grown up too long inside supervised schedules and legal paperwork. But when he looked at Samuel, something old and natural returned to his face. Recognition. Belonging. Samuel's scarred hand trembled as he touched his son's shoulder. No courtroom in the world could improve on silence like that. Months later, the legal aftermath reshaped Illinois itself. The state legislature passed a sweeping family court reform bill named the Monroe Equal Access Family Act. The law mandated full disability access compliance in all custody courts, bias review for racial disparities in family rulings, independent guardianship evaluators protected reporting systems for intimidation by court staff. On the day it was signed, Evelyn sat in the front row beside Lily, Samuel, and James. Olivia Bennett covered the ceremony from Springfield, where her investigative series had by then expanded into a national report on family court discrimination. 6 months later, in New York, her name was announced beneath the chandeliers of Columbia University's Pulitzer ceremony. She won for public service journalism. The camera found her in the audience, but her first text afterward went not to her editor. It went to Evelyn. "We changed more than one case. By spring, Colonel Evelyn Monroe had become something she never sought. A public voice, not a celebrity, a standard. She spoke at veterans centers, disability rights forums, and Black family justice conferences, always in the same calm, measured tone that had once stabilized trauma tents under bombardment. She never spoke about herself first. She spoke about access, dignity, and the danger of systems that confuse difference with deficiency. And every night, no matter how far the work took her, she came home to South Side Chicago. To pancakes sometimes shaped like stars. To Lily's homework spread across the dining table, to a little girl who no longer flinched at raised voices, to a ceiling that glowed softly over a room once filled with grief and now restored to peace. Home, at last, beneath the stars. Sometimes the deepest battles in life do not happen on a battlefield. They happen in courtrooms, in schools, in hospitals, in workplaces, and inside our own homes where dignity is quietly tested every day. Evelyn Monroe's story reminds us that a person's value is never measured by age, disability, skin color, or what others assume at first glance. Real strength is shown in patience, preparation, truth, and the courage to keep protecting the innocent even when the world tries to make you look weak. In everyday life, this lesson matters more than we realize. Before judging someone, take a moment to understand what they may have survived. The person in a wheelchair may be the strongest soul in the room. The quiet child may be carrying fears no child should ever know. The elderly woman others ignore may be the one holding an entire family together. Education begins with empathy, and justice begins with how we choose to treat people in ordinary moments. This story also teaches us to speak up when systems, workplaces, schools, or communities treat people unfairly because of race, disability, age, or background. Silence protects broken systems, but courage repairs them. Even small daily actions like offering respect, listening carefully, helping someone access a doorway, or defending a person being judged unfairly can become the beginning of real change. My honest reflection on this story is that it mirrors real life in a powerful way. Too often, society mistakes physical limits for weakness and difference for inability. The truth is that character, love, and moral courage are what truly raise families and heal communities. Stories like this educate us to become kinder parents, fairer leaders, better neighbors, and more responsible citizens. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Tell us in the comments what lesson stayed with you the most. If you believe love, dignity, and justice should always win, type Amen in the comments so this message can reach more people. And if you want more powerful, life-changing stories, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss the next journey. May God bless every person watching, protect your family, heal your heart, and fill your home with peace, courage, and light. Amen.